So I haven't taken a shower in like 5 days, obviously. And I haven't changed clothes since I've last taken a shower, Texas forever. And I haven't gone outside in like 4 weeks. So this lockdown season for me has been basically, well, the same as really any other time, except one kind of big difference. My wife, Lauren, is now working from home, which means she has one, taken over my office, and two, I actually have to do some work now. I can't just, sit around and do nothing. So I ended up writing an article about Luke chapter 16, the parable of the dishonest manager. And after finishing it and reading through it, it read a lot like a sermon. So I decided, what the hell? I'm just going to preach the sermon here. So I hope you enjoy it. The parable of the dishonest manager basically goes like this. There was a really rich guy who heard a rumor that the manager of his estate was wasting his money. He decided to fire him, but before having security escort him from the premises, he told his manager to go all by himself to retrieve all the confidential financial information. The manager, like a failed preacher, had no other job prospects. He was desperate to keep his job. So he did the only reasonable thing he could to impress his boss. He manipulated the books, lowering the amount of debts all the peasants owed to him, significantly lowering the rich guy's profits. After discovering this, the rich guy thought, wow, what a great manager, and decided to keep him. Then Jesus told all of his disciples to maybe act like the manager, because a life centered on money is really bad. It's a great story, Luke. Thanks, buddy. The previous story is the parable of the prodigal son, which may just be the best story in the entire Bible. The story that follows is the rich man and Lazarus, another all-star level story that has everything from rich people being condemned to hell for the crime of being rich, and poor people nearly being eaten by wild dogs because they're too poor. It's tough company, but the parable of the dishonest manager makes up for it by being the weirdest and most confusing parable in the New Testament. I could spend a lot of time breaking down the economic and political issues at play. And I did. I wrote an article that meticulously went through all the background and competing analysis and writing up my own interpretation. And then my laptop was corrupted and I lost everything. I spent the next 24 hours crying about it, and I couldn't go outside to buy Sour Patch Kids. I was super distraught. So I planned on writing a shorter version. Then it got longer. Much of the background and economic info here is from William Herzog's Parables as Subversive Speech, which is amazing, and I am obsessed. So hope you enjoy. Anything in there that sounds particular about background info or stats or economics, that's all Herzog. It's definitely not me. So on an estate like the one we see in the parable of the dishonest manager, peasants work the land of rich landowners. Rich guys who prefer to live in the city, they hire these managers to handle their affairs. Managers write contracts, they collect money, and they end up threatening people. The best managers are people who understand the culture of peasants, but they can also read, write, and keep track of finances. So rich guys identify a promising peasant or people who come from such stock. They invest tons of money into him, make him completely reliant on their patronage, and then turn him against the other people in their social class. The manager, after betraying his own people, they can never return to life in their community, and they must faithfully serve their master for life. The wealthy found out a way to turn hatred of the rich into a weapon against the poor. The manager, he ends up making money by taking an under-the-table cut on each deal. Everybody expects this. Everybody knows that it happens. If he takes too much, he risks upsetting his master and losing his job. If he doesn't take enough, well, then there's no point in becoming a manager. The upside to being hated by everyone and being isolated from your community is money, a lot of money. Peasants, they hate managers. Managers take what peasants believe belongs to them, and they betray their own people. Peasants barely have enough to survive as it is. Landowners, they distrust managers. They think that managers are cheating them, and they're usually right. Managers, for their part, they're afraid of everyone. If a manager receives a generous bribe from a peasant, the manager will negotiate a better deal. But if he demands too much, the peasants start rumors and the rich landowner may fire him. For the manager, being fired isn't like you or me being fired. Being fired for him is a death sentence. After a year or two, the manager will certainly be dead. There are no competing job offers. Managers fired for wasting money will never be hired by any other rich landowner because the entire point is to make managers completely reliant on their masters. The existence of alternative options ruins the whole scheme. His other options, the Bible tells us, are digging and begging. He cannot dig. Managers are not manual laborers. They don't have the strength, they don't have the skills, they don't have community support. A manager also cannot beg. A fired manager is a traitor to his own people. He inspires no sympathy. Soon enough, malnutrition, disease, or violence will claim his life. He will die alone, and he will die in great pain. His only option is to keep his job. Many interpretations, like my own HarperCollins Study Bible, which is usually great, argue that the manager reduces his own cut to ingratiate himself to his master or to the peasants. This is a terrible interpretation. It's absolutely impossible. The parable tells us that the manager summoned the debtors one by one, reducing the debt to each. One man owed 100 jugs of oil. His bill was reduced by 50% to 50. Another man owed 100 bushels of wheat. His bill was reduced 20% to 80. An interpretation that claims that the manager is reducing his own cut would have to assume a preposterous commission equal to the entire amount of the bill. That's 100% commission. But a bigger problem is that the manager reduces the bill in the books. The manager's cut is always under the table. An interpretation that the manager is cutting his own commission must assume that the manager has decided to document his own crimes, which is especially problematic given the 100% commission, which would be entirely insane. If losing his job is a death sentence, why document justification for being fired? This interpretation does not even attempt to explain why he would reduce one bill by 50% and another by 20%. So luckily there are better options. Oil is a more risky investment than wheat, the two commodities that we see in the story. And oil is far more likely to spoil, and it's more difficult to transport and store. Given this, a 50% and 20% reduction of oil and wheat respectively is best explained as the manager removing interest, which corresponds to the level of risk for each product. Profits from interest always go to the owner of the debt. They never go to the manager. Interest is, of course, unlawful in Jewish society. Charging interest is one of the most flagrant violations of Jewish law. So if you're to charge interest, it needs to remain hidden, yet also be enforceable. Luke 16 shows a common tactic in hiding interest by including it in the total amount of the bill rather than as a separate line item. Besides the owner, only the manager who writes the contracts can prove that interest has been charged and is owed. Cutting out interest here isn't charity. Cutting interest is instead a threat to his former boss. Interest is unlawful, and the manager is threatening to expose him. The rich landowner can either accept the public praise of the peasants for being so generous by lowering their debt, or he can be exposed for charging interest and be known as incapable of controlling his own house. The landlord decides to choose praise and decides to recognize the value of a ruthless, shrewd manager working on his behalf. At the end of this story, debts are forgiven. Peasants are given a temporary respite from predatory lending, and they get to keep more of what belongs to them. The rich landlord is praised in public for upholding the Torah and being generous. The manager is saved from certain death, and he's brought back into his master's house. If we read this story as independent from the rest of the Gospel of Luke, it can tell us how the weak can triumph over the strong. It can provide examples of how the rich oppress the poor. These are useful lessons. They're common throughout the Bible, and we should hear them. But this parable isn't told in isolation. It's part of a group of stories that Jesus tells in response to criticism from Pharisees in the beginning of chapter 15. So Luke chapter 15, verse 2 says, "And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Jesus responds by telling 4 parables. So see if you can notice a pattern here. It's really hard to pick up. First is the parable of the lost sheep. It's a parable about a shepherd who loses a sheep. He leaves behind 99 sheep to search for the one who is lost. When he finds it, he gathers his friends and they rejoice. Second is the parable of the lost coin. It's a parable about someone who loses a coin. A woman searches her whole house, finds the lost coin, gathers her friends, and they rejoice. The first 2 parables here are exact mirrors of each other. By now, Jesus' response to the criticism of him welcoming sinners and eating with them should be clear. Jesus seeks out the lost. Having made his point, he could have just left it there, walked away, and be done. All of us would have understood the lesson and we could have applied it to our lives. But instead, Jesus keeps going. He tells 2 more parables. The question for us to figure out when interpreting the next 2 is, why does he do this? Why does he tell them at all? The third parable is a parable that many of us know. It's the parable of the prodigal son. It's a little more complicated, so I'm going to outline it here in kind of basic statements. The theme of seeking out the lost continues. First, you have the parable of the prodigal son. It shows the prodigal son squandered his property and his family. And the prodigal son faces isolation and death. The prodigal son schemes so his father will let him rejoin his house. The father offers forgiveness and welcomes him back. And the father's eldest son rejects the prodigal son as sinful and unworthy of forgiveness. And then the father's eldest son squanders his family. This parable is similar to the previous 2 in that something is lost. What is lost is found, and the people rejoice. The parable of the prodigal son introduces 2 new features. First, the son who is lost is at fault. No one blames a sheep for being lost or a coin for losing itself in a house. But here, being lost and facing isolation and death are entirely the fault of the prodigal son. Second, there's a third character who does not celebrate what is lost being found, and instead he adamantly rejects it. The prodigal son's older brother does not think his brother deserves forgiveness, which, if we're to be honest, is pretty understandable. The prodigal son is a pretty terrible brother and son. The parable introduces sin and rejection to the previous formula of something being lost, what is lost is found, and the people rejoicing. When this story is read as a response to the Pharisees' criticism of Jesus, that Jesus is sitting with sinners and eating with them, it becomes apparent that the older brother's rejection of the prodigal son is comparable to the Pharisees' rejection of sinners who sit and eat with Jesus. Like the Pharisees, the older brother follows the rules, but he knows neither forgiveness or love. In all the parables that he tells, Jesus isn't just telling moralistic stories. Jesus is answering the Pharisees' criticism with criticism of his own. Having told stories of a lost coin and a lost sheep, which no one could object to, he set up the Pharisees in a rhetorical trap. Once you concede that the shepherd should look for lost sheep, it becomes harder to claim that God shouldn't seek out what God has lost. Even though the prodigal son is unworthy of forgiveness, his unworthiness only strengthens the virtue of his father. After all, who can fault a father for loving his children? The Pharisees have rejected God's children, but God has not. When God's children are lost, God finds them. Jesus isn't done. He has one story left. He's already criticized the Pharisees for rejecting those who are lost. He already caught them in his trap. So who's left? The final parable we have is the parable of the dishonest manager. The parable follows the exact same pattern as the parable of the prodigal son. It follows the same theme with an identical structure and uses identical language found nowhere else in the New Testament. The term squandered his property. Luke 15, verse 13, it says, "A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living." 16, verse 1 says, charges were brought to him, the manager, that this man was squandering his property. You don't see this language anywhere else in the New Testament. You do see it in Proverbs. Furthermore, these two stories, or this story here, is the last parable in a set of four in which the first two parables are exact mirrors of each other. So you have the same theme, you have an identical structure, you have identical language in a story that follows two other stories that mirror each other perfectly. So as a result, we should consider these final two stories, prodigal son and the dishonest manager, similarly linked. Unlike the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the dishonest manager does not have a sympathetic patron like the prodigal son's father, even though the prodigal's father is a land-owning rich slave owner, something we seem to forget for some reason. Instead, this story has an absentee landlord who preys upon peasants. But like the parable of the prodigal son, the central character here is lost because he has rejected his people and his community, and he's done it for money. We understand that the parable of the prodigal son is a trap because we sympathize with a father who forgives his son. We sympathize with him when he pleads for his older brother who has followed all the rules to forgive his brother who broke all of them. When the older brother doesn't forgive, even though he is blameless and his younger brother is guilty and sinful, we immediately recognize that the virtue of forgiveness is more important and more valuable than the inevitable results of sin. We side with the father and identify the Pharisees with the older brother who cannot forgive. Because the characters in the parable of the dishonest manager have no apparent redeeming qualities, they all seem to be pretty awful except for the peasants who are just trying to live their lives. It isn't obvious what Jesus is doing. I argue that this parable is a mirror of the parable of the prodigal son, like the first two parables mirror each other. If this is right, who in this story rejects what is lost being found? Like the prodigal's older brother rejects him against the wishes of his father. Who is Jesus criticizing this time around? After reading three stories of celebrating what is lost being found, and the people rejoicing in stories about lost coins, lost sheep, and lost sons, does anybody celebrate the manager saved from death? Do the peasants? Does the rich man? Do you? I think we reject his forgiveness. The parable is so difficult to interpret, in my opinion, because Jesus has laid a rhetorical trap. When we hear the parable of the dishonest manager, we tend to think the lesson is that he got away with something, and that we need to be wise and shrewd in a difficult world. The whole point of a trap is to fall into it without realizing it. And if you don't get who Jesus is criticizing, it may just be because Jesus is criticizing you. This time, he's laid a trap for us. We don't think the manager is worthy of forgiveness. We don't celebrate death turned to life. We don't celebrate what is lost being found. Our only response to him is condemnation. You can check for yourself. Read the text. Does this story provide any evidence that the manager is being dishonest? And if so, by whose standards? If you think the manager is dishonest because he cut out interest, you're taking the side of a rich landowner praying against peasants, and against the very peasants themselves and the laws in the Torah. If you don't celebrate him because, in fact, he's sinful, you're taking the side of the Pharisees. Jesus is criticizing us. The parable of the dishonest manager, just like the parable of the prodigal son, it looks like this. The dishonest manager squandered his property in his community. The dishonest manager faces isolation and death. The dishonest manager schemes so his master will retain him in his house. The manager forgives him and welcomes him back. The listener rejects the dishonest manager as sinful and unworthy of forgiveness. The listener then squanders the kingdom. Jesus is claiming that we're just like the Pharisees. And in this, he's not wrong. We're approaching now the end of an especially odd season of Lent. It's the traditional Christian observance when the faithful prepare for Easter through spiritual practices like fasting and self-denial. Lent in 2020 finds many of us in isolation in our homes, or otherwise limiting physical proximity with others due to a global pandemic. Except for me, I do this all the time. In a season where many of us choose to give something up, this Lenten lockdown has denied much of us our normal lives, luxuries and necessities alike. In addition to all this, many are sick, many have died, and many more will follow. This whole thing seems to have come at the church sideways. The church, we claim in loud voice that Jesus triumphs over death. But we cannot say it together now for fear of dying. We say that Jesus sits and eats with sinners. But now we find ourselves dining alone. We tell of stories of Jesus healing the sick, but many churches who have insisted to gather together anyway to tell our old stories have been at the center of outbreak and disease. The church is weak and fractured in many places, but the pandemic didn't attack us there. It hit us in all the places where we're strong, and still it found us lacking. During Lent, spiritual disciplines seem to have become the central player. But in part, this is because the church has increasingly become insular. Spiritual disciplines are what we do for ourselves. People outside the faith don't fast for Lent, after all. But the church has used these great 40 days of Lent for purposes other than just invigorating the faith of its adherents. The 40 days of Lent were once the final days of preparation for those who were to be baptized and welcomed into the fullness of the church. And it was a time when the church would seek out those whose sins were so great that they had separated themselves from the church and its people. Lent was a time to seek out the lost, remembering too that we were once found, whether by accident, like a woman who loses a coin, by one's own nature, like a sheep separated from its flock, by youthful stupidity, like a prodigal son estranged from his family, or by greed and betrayal, like the dishonest manager from his own people. Lent is a season to seek out those who find themselves alone. It matters little the reasons why. These days will be long, and they will be dark. For those of us who hide in the shadow of the cross, even in weakness, we know that we're not alone. Yet it has become painfully obvious that there are so many who are alone. And for the first time, we have come to know that they're just right next to us. We've come to know how close they really are. The lonely are 6 feet away, and we cannot touch them. We are separated by a window or a door, and we cannot visit. In a pandemic, the very presence of other people, it fills us with fear and dread. Years ago, I chose to isolate myself from the church and from my home. by running away as far as I could. I made it as far as the biblical wilderness. The truth is, I like it here. More than most, I'm prepared for a life of social isolation and distance. I've been doing it for a while. And I've done that in part because I've always struggled to meet people, whether they were lonely or lost or not. I can fake it well enough, but I never knew quite how to get over the feelings of panic and fear with most interaction. For a long time now, much of normal life has eluded me due to feeling this way. There are times when I miss meals because I'm too afraid to go outside. In grad school, I would often forget to go to lunch in our cafeteria out of fear of others, even when those others were my friends. Trying to work this out while working as a pastor was a constant struggle, one in which I never did overcome. Seeking out the lost is what we are called to do, but it often seems impossible when seeking out your friends and loved ones is hard enough. The problem of how to interpret the parable of the dishonest manager is easy enough for me to figure out. It's the concluding parable in a series of 4 in response to criticism from Pharisees about Jesus spending so much time with sinners. His response is that he seeks out the lost. Then he criticizes those that don't. That includes Pharisees who by definition separate themselves from others in an attempt to vigorously follow the law. It also includes his own followers who are eager to separate themselves from people like the dishonest manager in their vigorous attempt to be more Christ-like. I'm sure we all know Christians who are just so Jesus-y that we can't stand to be around them. I'm probably one of those, to be honest. Sorry. Our desire for good is never going to escape our capacity to condemn. But our capacity to condemn will never surpass God's desire to seek out the lost. I can understand that the parable of the dishonest manager is telling us to seek out the lost, even when we don't think that they're worthy. But how we do that, I've never known. And I'm not going to figure it out now. So if you're looking for a how in accomplishing the demands of the parable in a time of crisis, you're not going to find it here. I don't know how to seek out the lost. But I do know what it feels like to be alone. And I know what it feels like to be afraid. And if that's you, especially if you're new to these feelings, alone in your home, even if surrounded by people, afraid of going outside, interacting with others, panicking in a crowd, desiring to interact and retreat all at once, not knowing when or how or if this ends. I've been there. I'm there right now. Still, I believe that we're not alone. God seeks out the lost. He called the church to seek us out, even when we don't want it. God has placed that obligation on you too, even when you don't know how. And finally, I believe, because I've lived it for a while now, you're going to be okay. It's going to be okay. God hasn't forgotten. So, feel free to reach out to me about it. If you have any questions, 50-50 chance I get back to you.